now it's time to speak about sword, the fun part, the sword, the sword, because this is a thing. I really have this idea. Many people, especially in Italy, but I think around the world it's almost the same, have some very misconception of the sword, and just say, okay. The basic people probably say something like, "Oh, a medieval sword, it's 50 kilos," or something like that. But inside the medieval reenactment or the HEMA, the sport fencing, etc., have this idea the medieval sword is something incredibly heavy, like a pipe of steel, or something like that for bashing.
I mean, this has changed a lot. I think there's a much better awareness now, thanks to certain people. Where Peter Johnson played a big part, but also, people, thanks to things like Ilya and Baltimore Knife and Swords with their work on Men at Arms Reforged, and on now what Ilya does with Matt, That Works channel. Such people have really opened the eyes, I think, a lot to the public, so we can really be grateful for that. So there's a better understanding, but of course you still have a big majority of people that have a very strange misconception on how a sword is, what it is as an object, and what it should perform like. There's a very wide range. It's very interesting to see.
But this is beautiful because, especially for me, in the start, when I don't know you, etc., I see all this kind of replica, my replica too, it's the same, and you see this kind of sword, and it's almost 2 kilos, something like that. And next time you just check the catalog of some museum, and you see, this is 1 kilo.
How do they do that?
How is possible? When I go in this very nice museum in Palazzo Venezia, they have a huge collection of weapons, and I see the real sword, and I say, "Fuck! Why mine is not like that?"
Yeah, this is, I think, in general, a big misconception of sword practitioners, sword users, sword lovers, enthusiasts, is a sword is a three-dimensional object. So you cannot just make it out of a ground-up bar. You have to give profile in all directions to it. And swords get, by most people, defined by the overall shape of it. When they look at it from distance, when it hangs on the wall, they see that's a sword and that is not. Where a person who has a bit of a deeper understanding of this object and its use and its, and especially in its field of use, so in its context of its martial art, in its context of how it's being used, you have a much more defined separation of what a sword is and what not. So we have this term of a sword-like object in the sword-making community. We say, it looks like a sword when you stand a couple meters away, but
if you go near,
representation of what a sword really is. You can't use it as a reference for what should be a sword like, because it is not just a pure visual thing. It is especially a thing about the physics, the entire integrity of the sword and how it is, the weight distribution and edge geometry and handle geometry. There's an entire range, of course, in what you have to take care for when you try to make one. And it's easier to just grind the bar out and let it look the shape of a sword than actually working it down to the thicknesses it should have in certain places. And it's scary because in our mind, something is only solid enough for the job if it looks solid. And swords can look very fragile. They are. I mean, when you have only 2 millimeter blades tip,
it's fucking scary. Grind that.
Hit too hard things with it.
And this is probably another big mistake, because now great part of people, like you say, is they just using the sword like a iron bar and just bashing with all the force. And this is another thing, because in the start, I have this kind of mentality, like, the blade needs to be fat because it needs to keep in the heat or something like that. But next time, And this is incredible because the original sometimes is just paper thin. It's incredible.
Now, of course, I mean, the general misconception, I think, is that people use or think that weapons should be an enforcement of, or an enlargement of power. So, if the heavier, the better. But that is, quite frankly, bullshit. A weapon is there to cancel out differences in force, in power. So, a sword is not there for the strong man to use. A sword is there for the normal person to use, and ideally, as a weapon is designed in a way that it cancels out the differences in strength. So it doesn't matter if you're 1 meter 95 tall and have 120 kilos of muscle weight, or if you are 1 meter 50 and you only weigh 60 kilos. Or if one person can bench press 160 kilo and the other one only 30 kilos. As soon the sword comes into play, it should cancel that out. That's the idea of a sword. So it's an agile weapon. It's about precision and speed. And in order for it to be fast, you need to make it light. You need to make it very well balanced. And you can see very fast if a sword works in its entire concept or not. If you develop an eye for it, of course. Yeah.
Another very interesting thing for me is all this kind of physics behind the weapon and how it's incredible. What you say is it's not a muscle weapon, and how just 100 grams leave from the tip. It's completely different. 10
grams on the tip.
Yeah.
Or edit, or edit somewhere else, or taken somewhere else. I mean, we had recently this beautiful moment. Recently, it's almost half a year ago. I made this arming sword, and yeah, you remember I made the pommel for it in the pretty much the dimensions I wanted it to be, and I thought that's fine. And then I had to take 40% off that pommel. Because the pommel was too heavy. That works. Yeah, a pommel can be too heavy. So it created this kind of weird counter track that when a sword is tip heavy, you cut with it and you feel how the blade just drags your hand further and you can't really stop it. It takes a lot of effort. And if a sword is perfectly balanced, you can stop it mid-motion without any effort. It should just stay. And there was the exact opposite. It was weird. The blade was super light, and the pommel would just continue moving. And you always had this weird twisting motion. You wanted to stop it, and the pommel would just push after. So it was again unbalanced. You can overbalance a sword. That was a strange moment.
Yeah. One of the first trick you teach me when you are here is, and this is completely stunning for me, is the pivot point and the movement of the tip of the sword, and this is incredible, crazy.
Yeah, for me, the magic moment when I was there was an eye opener when I was at Peter Johnson's place. He told me about that quite a few years before he wrote the book on this topic, sword and form. He showed me this effect, the pivot point, how you can manipulate the rotation point around which the sword moves by taking weight. And it's not a question of the overall weight of the sword. It's about where the weight is, and it's not even a question of the balance point. You can have two swords that look exactly similar, that weigh exactly the same. They have the balance point pretty much exactly the same, but the pivot point can be completely different. But the pivot point really decides on how the sword handles. That's really what makes it feel alive or just a chunk of steel. And it takes a lot of attention to detail to get there. It was, for me, an absolute amazing moment, because I'm a HEMA practitioner at that point when I was at this place for many years, and for about about 6 years at that point, I think, and I was there like, shit, that changes the entire perspective on how to move the sword. And how to handle it, how to utilize it. It was weird, yeah. It's a funny, it's the typical, for people that don't know what we're talking about, the pivot point is, I also like to call it the chicken head point. So,
chicken head point?
Yeah, so if you take a chicken and you move it around, the head just stays perfectly hot. So the gimbal effect, like the camera gimbals, do exactly that. So or your microphone does it as well, I think, right? If you move around,
if I move this one jiggling,
the microphone always stays straight. And this effect you can create in a sword, and you can place that point pretty much wherever you want. For certain swords, you place it in different positions.
This is absolutely crazy for me, and it's incredible, beautiful, and this is probably a little trick. I don't know how much the people know that. It's incredible how it's easy to start with the bar and grinding that in the shape of sword, like the chip reproduction, and they are strong enough, doesn't break and doesn't have some particular case on it, and it's incredible how amount the time for go from that to a real sword, a nice sword.
It takes patience, and of course it takes a lot of, when I say practice, especially it takes a lot of confidence as well. If you will become faster with it with the time, but you have to, you have the confidence of grinding that steel down there to this really thin tips and very thin blade shapes and angles, and the angles are transitioning into other angles. You have to become confident with it in order to really create something that is that you can reproduce, that you can repeat over and over. It's not just a luck thing to do. And then of course, I think in general, when it comes to sword making, it is an almost dangerous idea to just rely on one particular skill set. Especially sword making is really something where you have to hit a wide range of different skills. A friend of mine, a really good one in Germany, Peter Brunner is his name. He's one of the most incredible blacksmiths I know. Probably, from the ones I know personally, probably the best. He's amazing. You put him on the power hammer, he creates the shapes.
Everything.
He manipulates steel like it's clay. He's like a potter. He's really, really, really skilled, and he always smiles a bit at me when I speak about sword making. He's always like, "Yeah, you play too much Skyrim," or and he has good reasons for it, because his approach on that topic is the same mistake that most people do when they think about sword making. Is it's blacksmithing, most people that want to become swordsmiths, they want to be blacksmiths. They call themselves blacksmiths as well, and that's a dangerous thing to do, because by now I have done both, and I have to say very honestly, it has nothing to do with blacksmithing. Yes, of course we do use the anvil and we do blacksmith from time to time, but the complexity of the blacksmithing, the amount of techniques that I use, blacksmithing techniques that I use in order to create a sword, are pretty much as high as the blacksmithing techniques a farrier uses, so making horseshoes. It's a couple very simple blacksmithing techniques, and you need to pretty much perfect them to really be efficient with it and make sense to use them, and not to just grind out or whatever. So the forging can be a very good tool, but in order to make a good sword, you don't need to know how to forge. What is much more important is grinding. You need to know how to grind. 80% of the work is grinding. And even if you forge super close to shape, there are people that are really, really good at it. Ilya is one of those.
Faber, it's incredible.
The masters of it. I mean, I'm stunned when I look at his work.
It's really incredible.
I mean, but still, for him, it's still the same. There is way over 50% of the work that he has to do on the sword is grinding work, and you don't get around it because you want to have certain surface qualities, and you want to have certain precision. And there's a nice saying, forge big, grind small. So always forge bigger than you need and then grind it down to. So a swordsmith is not a blacksmith in his blacksmith, because as a blacksmith you have techniques. I would almost dare to challenge, that's a very bold statement what I do now, I think I know certain forging techniques. If I would challenge sword makers to make them, over 50% of them would fail. Would fail in the attempt, or they would really, really work hard to get there. So you don't need to be a good blacksmith to make swords, and certainly most swordsmiths are not good blacksmiths. If you ask them to make a gate, probably they have.
He can't.
But you need other crafts. Sword making really combines a lot of. You have to do leather work, and in order to let it look good, you have to be decent at it. You have to know jewelry work. You have to, new woodworking. Depends on what kind of swords and scabbards and whatever you make.
Yeah.
So yeah, you have to build up to a very wide range. Quite a wide range of crafts and skills, but probably none of them in their entire complexity.
Yeah, very specific task. This is another thing I deep in some of my research, because every code I found, every manuscript, when they spoke about the swordsmith, is just a guy make the blades, and that's it. And around the 15th century, you can start see this huge lab with different kind of artisans, and everyone is very specific in one part of the work.
One makes the handles, one makes the crossguard, and of course there were artisans. There were in Austria was a swordsman. I always forget his name. He made the sword for the Emperor Maximilian I, which is an absolutely outstanding sword. Everyone should check that out. It's a two-handed sword with I don't know how many fullers. They're always just short, but they're in a chess field alliance, and it's completely, the entire blade is covered in damascene from the hilt to the tip, and it's with pictures and writings, and the cross guard is hollow with like breakthroughs out of silver, and the handle is hollow out of silver and gold.
Whoa!
Floral ornaments and breakthrough. It's an absolutely gorgeous work, and this is done by, as we know, from one person. So you had that, and you had it already earlier, but that was always the exception, because in difference to today, the sword was a weapon of war. It was a weapon of everyday carry. Every civilian owned more or less a sword, or a sword-like object like a messer or a falchion. That was something that had to be produced in
mass production.
Pretty much, of course, highly customized. There was not, because every artisan, you give that blade to the hilt maker, and he makes the crossguard and the pommel for it, and he feels like making another crossguard right now. So. Or very often, probably it was also the case that you went into the trader's store and you're like, I want this blade, I want this crossguard fitted to it, and this pommel, and so they just combined it quickly and gave you the sword. But it was highly specialized. It's like today, industry. If you build a car, you don't make all the parts in one factory. There are highly specialized factories. They won't make the engines. The other one just makes the pistons from the engines, and it's all every part is somehow, and that's how it was with the swords, with any kind of weapons. You didn't have, and of course today the sword is not anymore an everyday use tool or weapon that you have, an everyday carry. It is a luxury item. That's what it is. We don't need to talk about anything of this being a useful thing today. Even though some Americans probably believe different. It's awesome to I don't know, chop intruders into pieces. And probably it is, it's probably good fun, but no, in general it's a luxury item. No one today anymore needs a sword. People want a sword.
This is a nice thing for us.
I'm really grateful because, of course, it's an awesome object with a lot of history behind it and a certain, a certain mythology about. Many mythologies behind it. There's a certain feel to a sword, an appeal that speaks for itself, and because of being a luxury item today, most swords produced don't need to be produced in mass production. There are some companies that do it in high numbers for sport reasons or whatever, but there are much more makers that are much smaller, and they just have to do everything by themselves, because otherwise it would be not
over the market probably.
Yeah, like if you have to involve in one sword 4 people, you have to, everyone has to get a share and blah blah blah. And also, let's be honest, it lowers the fun.
This is one of the fun part.
The entire project, diving into all these different crafts that are involved, that's probably the fun. I mean, working all day long and just forging sword blades gets pretty much every custom sword maker today makes custom swords because he was sick of working in a job where he had to do the same thing 100 times over and over again.
Yeah, absolutely. But this is another thing I say many times in my Italian video is now many people see a sword and looks something ages, very ancient and blah blah blah. But for that period, where that kind of sword is made, is the apogeo of technology. It's the very top of the technology. It's the fighters.
It's a Ferrari.
It's a Ferrari of that, yeah.
I mean, most swords we find today in museums are probably, high status weapons because they were just better preserved. We do have a lot of examples of, lower class swords. The interesting part is that they're still really well crafted. I mean, they were crafted to function.
Yeah.
They were not necessarily crafted to look pretty in every case, even though they almost always put somewhere some detail on it or an inscription in the blade, which was super popular during the 12th and 13th century.
Yeah.
Or everything before that as well. I mean, if you look into Viking blades, almost all of them have some sort of magical spells and whatever written into the blade. But they mainly were crafted to function. And it is today not different. If you want to have a tool, a machine, a weapon to function, it has to be well made.
Yeah.
It can't be done sloppy. If your rifle as a soldier is done sloppy and it jams all the time, it's shit. So it's useless. Then you can also leave it home and run naked into war. It's the same thing. The risk is probably even less because you might be treated as a civilian. So, and it's the same as back then. You have to make it functional, and functionality usually requires a quite precise approach on design. So we call it today functional design. But in order to function in coexistence or in cooperation with the human body, you need to serve that. So you have to make handles that fit well. You have to make cross guards that have the right proportions for it to be protective, but also still functional to move the sword around. It's all these things. So
another thing I always see in the original pieces is they are insanely nice to see. And this is almost for all the artisan stuff made, especially in the past, because in the past, be an artisan, it's a very important job. And you see the proportion of sword. It's very clean. Yeah. It's very pretty. Maybe it's a simple sword. It's incredible simple, but it's pretty to see.
Design.
Yeah.
I mean, we do that again today. These kind of clean designs, of pure shape. And Peter Johnson again, always have to name it with that, is when it goes to sword proportions to design, did crazy, amazing research on it. So if anyone is interested, check it out.
Absolutely.
On creating how to design swords in a way and how they maybe have designed them. I mean, it fits almost too well in order to not to be like that. And yeah, function calls for a really good design. And also, I think they had back then the same pride that we have today, is making things neat.
Yeah.
Not just being happy to put your mark on it and be like, I made it.
Be proud of that, yeah. I've just spoke about the modern market, and this is very nice because it's a good part. It's just people want a nice collection of sword, but another strange market. It's not only big, but it's strange. Is of course the HEMA, the guys using for fencing, for medieval fencing, the sword. And this is a very strange market for me because I'm starting in this market, so it's a very nice stuff. And
Feather out of the corner there now.
no, absolutely no. But it's very strange for me because when I starting, I have this approach. So the idea, the sword need to be a very huge, need to
all the stress in the world.
yeah, exactly, because you need to use all your force. And another thing it's completely stunning me is the Feathersword, in all Germans say is a very light sword, but this is incredible for me because it's 1.5 kilos usually, and I say, okay, I need to keep a normal sword much more than 1.5 kilos because if the very light sword is 1.5 kilos, a normal sword is much more than 1.5 kilos, and this is incredible for me because a normal sword is not so heavy.
Yeah. Federschwert is of course you could translate it in two different ways. You could call it the light sword, the feather sword, or you could call it also the spring sword. Feder in German is also for the spring.
Whoa.
But probably it's more likely that it's the light sword. Because steel back then didn't spring that much, even though they had some that did, but not to the extent that we expect a feather sword today to do. Why light sword? It's hard to tell. I mean, it is quite a bit longer than a normal, long sword that you would, a sharp long sword that you would use. It's quite a bit longer. Talking somewhere between 10 to 20 centimeters longer, it's total length. So it is quite a big sword.
Yeah.
And for that size, it is light.
But the point is that I really think the original one, it's not 1.5 kilos. It's much lighter.
It might be much lighter, yeah. I actually never looked onto original ones. I know there are just a couple examples, like one or two. I don't know. But yeah, I had spoke a couple months back with Ilya from That Works. And he had a very interesting idea of that the feather sword itself might have not even been steel in most cases, but just very low carbon steel or even wrought iron. Because when you look on how the sword is constructed and the way it is described to be used in the manuals, it almost seems to be a dummy sword. a sport and dummy sword, so that you say, okay, like you say today with gun uses or so, where you say, okay, first fire some blanks and get to know the gun, or when you, what's another good example? You know, if you forge, hit first, to stay in the topic of craftsmanship, hit a bit around on lead instead of the steel directly, so you can't mess things up too fast. So these kind of learn on the tool, on the specific tool, train with that, become good at it, and then you can make sure that you use a proper sword in the right way. And if you look metallurgically back onto historical swords, they are sometimes surprisingly soft. I mean, we have swords where we talk about 42 rock metal, and that's, in today's standards, that's way too low. That's pretty much C45.
Yeah.
And if you have a sword that you use for training and for sport purpose, that is as soft as the softest swords, or even softer, and then also has the really thin blade, you can imagine what you do with this sword if you do a wrong move. This sword will bend, it will saber, it will notch very deeply, very fast, and you will destroy it if you use it wrong. And maybe this is just a concept, and maybe the feather sword had also been used to train people in order to ensure that they use the sword in the right way afterwards, because a sword is expensive, and if you mess up too many swords in your lifetime, it becomes quite expensive and not affordable for most people. And also, it makes no sense. Why would you? Why would you trash a sword to pieces if you can kill the other person also with far less effort?
And this is absolutely one of my this is so strange for me, because when you see movie combat or many of the HEMA combat, the guys just bash both of the sword exactly 90 degrees on the edge, and man, if you see an original one, you can't.
Yeah, it's not only, I mean, you can, and probably
you can once.
Do it 1 or 2 times, and then your sword might give up. And I mean, you see that descriptions in Japanese paintings. You see samurai sitting on the side of the battlefield, you know, hammering their sword straight again, and then super deep notches. Because of course it happens in the heat of combat. You just, you know, survival mode, and you just with it, and it's a tool. But that's not the art the manuals describe. The manuals don't describe the art of battlefield combat, of just bashing each other's head, and in the ideal case you don't use your sword there in that context anyway, so you use an axe or a mace or a spear. You just use a simple weapon that can't get messed up too much but can mess others up really fast. So the sword was much more a weapon for the civilian world. So you're on the road, on the street, it's a good travel weapon, it's a good weapon in the streets. You get into a fight, you use that sword. So you encounter mostly unarmored opponents, and that's where the sword becomes highly efficient. And going on with force and breaking these swords is highly risky, because you might not just find one person, but 2 or 3 in that day. So I think that the approach of going heavy onto the sword is a very dangerous one, as soon you would actually go into the context of using a sharp weapon.